What does it take to make the most feared man in Montreal go quiet? Not a rival's bullet, not a threat whispered in a parking garage. It took a heavy-set bookkeeper in a borrowed serving apron, a red felt pen, and a refusal to be afraid. Maxime Volkov walked into the Maison Corbeau on a black February night, expecting the whole room to lower its eyes the way it always did. He expected the plump woman balancing his table's plates to flush and stammer when he carved her down in front of his men. Instead, she handed him back his own arithmetic, corrected in front of everyone, and watched the pride drain out of his face onto the white linen. This is a story about numbers, about cruelty, and about a debt that could only be settled with a kingpin on his knees. The snow had been coming down all evening, fat and silent, burying the cars along Rue Saint-Denis. Inside the Maison Corbeau, the air was warm with butter and seared meat, and the low gold of 40 candles, and Maeve Donnelly could tell the exact second the temperature in the room dropped, even though the heat hadn't changed at all. The conversations near the front thinned out. Forks went still. Somebody at table 9 cleared his throat, the way men do when they're suddenly afraid of being noticed. She didn't need to turn around. She'd worked the books at the Corbeau for 3 winters, and she'd learned the rhythm of the place the way you learn the breathing of someone asleep beside you. When that hush rolled back from the entrance like a tide pulling out, it meant only one thing. The wolf had come in from the cold. Maxime Volkov was not, on paper, a criminal. On paper, he owned a parking empire, 2 construction firms, and a stake in half the nightclubs on the Main. In the back rooms and the snow-packed alleys, he owned a great deal more than that, and everybody at the Corbeau knew it, which was why Gilles Tremblay, the manager, came scuttling across the dining room, with sweat already glossing his bald head, before Volkov had finished shrugging off his black wool coat. Maeve. Gilles caught her thick forearm, his fingers cold and trembling. He was a decent man most nights, and a coward on the ones that counted. 2 of the girls walked out an hour ago. The snow, the buses. I have nobody for the back booth. You'll have to take it, his booth. Just keep your head down. Take the order. Do not look him in the eye. Get back to me. Yes? Please. Maeve set down the ledger she'd been reconciling at the service station. She was 31 years old, broad through the shoulders and broad through the hips. And she had stopped a long time ago, apologizing to the world for the amount of room she took up in it. Her serving apron didn't quite tie all the way comfortably, and the strings cut into the soft curve of her waist, and she'd long since decided that was the apron's problem and not hers. Relax, Gilles, she said, and her voice came out low and dry and steady, the way it always did when other people were losing their nerve. He's a man who eats supper. He doesn't bite the staff. He pays other people to do that for him. Gilles made a sound like a kettle starting to boil and fled toward the kitchen. She picked up a carafe of water and a leather menu and walked back across the dining room, and with every step she felt the eyes of the Volkov table swing toward her. There were 3 of them. The big one, a slab of a man with a shaved skull and a quiet face, sat with his back perfectly straight. Thomas, the regulars called him, though nobody said it loud. The young one beside him had restless hands and a habit of touching the lapel of his jacket. Where Maeve had long ago guessed there was something heavier than a wallet. And then there was the man in the center of the booth, the one the room was holding its breath for. Maxime Volkov had the kind of face that looked carved rather than born. Dark hair swept straight back, a jaw you could have measured with a ruler, and eyes the flat gray of the river when it freezes over. He wore a charcoal suit that fit him the way money fits men, who have never once worried about it, and he sat with the easy stillness of a man who had never in his adult life had to wait for anything he wanted. "Good evening, gentlemen," Maeve said, setting the water glasses down without a rattle. "Welcome back to the Corbeau. Can I bring you something from the bar while you look?" Volkov did not pick up the menu. He didn't look at her face, either. His grey eyes started at her chin and traveled down, slow and deliberate, taking in the round of her shoulders, the heavy fullness of her chest, the wide, soft span of her hips under the black skirt, and then came back up with a small, cruel curl already settling at the corner of his mouth. "Thomas," he said. His voice was a low, gravelled thing, and he pitched it just loud enough that the two nearest tables couldn't help but hear. "Remind me what I pay this place for the privilege of a private booth." "A great deal, boss," Thomas said quietly. "A great deal." Volkov let the words sit. Then he tilted his head toward Maeve, as though she were a piece of furniture that had been delivered to the wrong address. "And for a great deal of money, I expect to be served by someone who can move between the tables without rearranging the room. Tell me, did the dinner shift run out of waitresses and send out the dessert cart by mistake?" The young one snorted. Thomas didn't smile, but he didn't stop it either. 2 tables over, a woman in pearls put her hand to her mouth, and a silence spread out from the booth like a stain spreading through cloth. Now, most of the girls who worked the corbeau would have gone scarlet at that. Some would have laughed it off to keep the peace and hated themselves on the bus home. A few would have cried in the walk-in cooler. Maeve Donnelly had heard every variation of that joke since she was 9 years old, from kids and from grown men who should have known better. And somewhere along the way, the sting had cooled into something harder and colder and far more useful. What rose in her chest now was not shame. It was a clean, white, almost peaceful anger, the kind that makes your hands very steady. She did not flush. She did not look away. She set the carafe down with a soft click and reached, instead, into the apron pocket where she still kept the slip Gilles had handed her on her way over. The running tab the booth had built up over the past hour, drinks and an appetizer Volkov's men had ordered before he arrived, and she'd already done what she always did with a number put in front of her. She'd added it in her head. "My apologies, Mr. Volkov," she said, and her voice was sweet as maple and twice as slow. "I'd hate to take up more of the room than I'm worth, so let me earn my space. Your table's been charged for 2 bottles of the Barolo since 7 o'clock. She turned the slip toward him without quite handing it over. "You've had one. The bar charged you for the second when it went back uncorked. That's $85 somebody's lifting off you, while you're busy worrying about the size of the help." She let that settle for exactly 1 breath. A man who pays a great deal of money ought to count it now and then. It tends to walk. The silence in the dining room went absolute. You could have heard the snow against the windows. The young one's jaw came loose. Thomas's eyes went, very slightly, from Maeve to his boss and back, the way a man watches to see which way a fire is going to jump, and Maxim Volkov, who had not been corrected by anyone in front of anyone in more years than he could readily count, sat very still and looked at the heavy woman in the borrowed apron, as though she had reached across the table and slapped him. She had not raised her voice. She had not spilled a drop. She had simply, in the gentlest possible tone, made him look like a man being robbed at his own table, and made him look like a fool for missing it. The grey in his eyes darkened, the river thawing into something with a current under it. He rose out of the booth, slow, and he was a tall man, and he stepped into her space until he was looking down the length of his nose at her. Maeve tipped her chin up and refused to give back a single inch of floor. She could smell him, cold air, cedar, something expensive and faintly metallic underneath. "Do you have any idea," Volkov said, almost too quietly to hear, "who you are speaking to?" "I've a fair idea," Maeve said. Her heart was slamming against her ribs hard enough that she half thought he must be able to hear it, but her face stayed flat as a frozen pond. "You're the man who's about to be $85 poorer if he doesn't sort out his own bar staff. So, you can stand here breathing on me about who you are, or you can tell me how you'd like the ribeye, because I've got 4 other tables and none of them have insulted me yet tonight." For 5 long seconds, nobody at the Maison Corbeau moved. A muscle worked in the side of Volkov's jaw. He was a man who broke people for sport, who had built an empire out of other people's fear, and he was being looked at by a bookkeeper in a tied-too-tight apron, as though he were a draft coming in under a door. And then something cracked in his face. Not anger. Something stranger. A low, dark sound rolled up out of his chest. A laugh, short and disbelieving, and he sank back down into the booth and waved the young one quiet with 2 fingers. "Medium rare," he said. His grey eyes had not once left her face. "And the wine. Have them take the phantom bottle off the bill." "Medium rare," Maeve repeated, writing it down. "I'll see the kitchen doesn't overcook it. You strike me as a man who'd take it personally." She turned on her heel and walked away, and she could feel his stare burning a hole between her shoulder blades the whole length of the room. She made it through the kitchen door before her knees finally went. She caught the steel counter with both hands and stood there breathing like she'd run up 6 flights, while a line cook stared at her. "You all right, Maeve?" "Grand," she said. "Just grand." She was not grand. She knew exactly what she'd done. She'd made a man like that look small in his own kingdom, and men like that did not forget. When the Volkov table left 2 hours later, the snow still falling, Maeve went to clear it. Under the empty whiskey tumbler, weighted so it wouldn't blow off in the door draft, sat a crisp $100 bill and a square of folded napkin. On the napkin, in a hard slanting hand, someone had written, "You've a quick tongue and a quicker mind, bookkeeper. Both are going to get you into a great deal of trouble. I look forward to it." She should have been frightened. She told herself she was, but she folded the napkin into her apron pocket and kept it, and she did not entirely understand why. What followed was 3 weeks of the strangest siege of Maeve Donnelly's life. Volkov did not have her dealt with, the way her every instinct told her a man in his position would. Instead, he came back. He came back the next night, and the one after that, and he asked every single time that she be the one to bring his food. He turned it into a kind of warfare with rules only he understood. He'd stretch his long legs out into the aisle, so she had to edge her wide frame past him and watch her do it. He sent his ribeye back twice in one night and called her over to explain to her, slowly as if she were simple, exactly how he liked it. He left tips folded inside brochures, a gym, a meal replacement company, once a clinic, little folded cruelties tucked under the salt cellar, and Maeve, who could not afford to quit, because every loony of her real wages and her tips went home to her mother, Colleen, in Trois-Rivières, where the dialysis ran 3 days a week, and the government covered everything except the parts that mattered, swallowed her fear, and fought back in the only currency she had, which was nerve and arithmetic and a refusal to break. When he left a gym brochure, she made a $40 donation to a plateau pig sanctuary in his name and taped the thank you certificate to the underside of his reserved booth. When he complained the chairs were too narrow for someone of her displacement, she offered, very sweetly and very loudly, to fetch him a booster seat so he could see over his own ego. When he sent the wine back for the 3rd time in a week, she had the bar pour him a glass of the house red and charged him for the reserve and dared him with her eyes to count it. The truth, which Volkov would not have admitted under torture, was that she had become the most interesting thing in his life. He could not remember the last time someone had looked at him and seen anything other than money or death. Beautiful women arranged themselves in his path. Hard men went pale in his presence, and this woman, with her soft round arms and her wide easy hips and her terrible, perfect timing, looked at him like he was a stain on a tablecloth she hadn't decided whether to bother with. It drove him to the edge of his mind. He told himself he wanted to break her, just to prove she was like everyone else, just to watch the defiance go out of those steady eyes. He had not yet admitted to himself that he was, instead, falling. The strange dance shattered on a Thursday, the worst storm of the season, the kind of Montreal night where the city goes silent under 2 feet of snow, and the only people on the streets are the ones who can't stay home. The dinner rush had cleared early. Gilles was in the back office, counting the float. Maeve was alone at the bar, wiping down the mahogany, when the front door banged open on a gust of cold and two men came in stamping snow off their boots, and neither of them was Maxim Volkov. She knew the type before she knew the men. They were big and ugly and built for collecting debts. The taller one had a busted-up face and knuckles that had clearly broken more than they'd shaken. "Where's Tremblay?" he said. His accent was rough, East End. "Where's the manager?" "Gone home," Maeve said. "We're closed. You'll want to come back tomorrow." The shorter one came up to the bar and let his eyes drag over her, the same way Volkov's had that first night, except there was nothing in them but plain contempt. "Shut your mouth, Hefty. We know he's in the back. Emile Lachance wants his money. This place is 6 weeks behind on the Lachance arrangement, and the boss is done waiting." Cold dread settled low in Maeve's stomach, not at the threat, but at the word, Lachance. Because the Corbeau wasn't paying the Lachance crew. The Corbeau was on Volkov's books, every cent of it. She'd reconciled them herself 100 times. If Emile Lachance's men were standing in this dining room, talking about their arrangement, then somebody had been moving in on Volkov's territory, and somebody on the inside had been keeping 2 sets of numbers, and Maeve, who knew the real numbers cold, was suddenly the most dangerous person in the room, and the only one who didn't have a gun. "I said we're closed," she repeated, and she stepped out from behind the bar to put herself square in the mouth of the hallway that led back to the office and to Gilles. The shorter one laughed, an ugly, grating sound. "Look at the size of her. Thinks she's the bouncer." He stepped in and shoved her hard in the chest with both hands. Maeve went backward into a busing station, and a tray of stemware came down with her, glass shattering across the floor and slicing a thin red line up the back of her calf. The pain flared and then drowned in adrenaline. She came up off the station with a heavy cast-iron candle lantern in her fist. "Touch me again," she said low, "and they'll be finding bits of you in the snowbank come spring." The taller one's hand went to his belt and came up with a knife, and he lunged. And the front door of the Maison Corbeau came off its hinges. Maxim Volkov stood in the wreck of it, his black coat soaked through and white with snow, his face a mask of something past rage. Thomas and the young one were a half step behind, and they already had their guns out. "Put it down, Renaud," Volkov said. He didn't shout. He never shouted. His voice cut the room cleaner than the knife. "You're a long way off your patch." The 2 debt collectors went very still. They knew exactly who had just filled the doorway. The taller one, Renaud, raised his free hand. "This is Lachance business, Volkov. He claims the Corbeau now. They owe me," Volkov said, and he stepped into the room, the broken door crunching under his shoe. He did not look at Maeve, but every line of his body had turned toward her like a compass finding north. And nobody walks into my city, breaks my glass, and lays a hand on what's mine. Across the room, even through the fear, Maeve felt her jaw tighten at that. What's mine? She wasn't a parking lot. But there was no time to say it, because what happened next happened fast. Volkov moved. For a big man in a heavy coat, he was appallingly quick. He crossed the floor and was on the knife man before Renaud could set his feet, and he didn't reach for a gun. He took the wrist, twisted until something gave with a wet crack, and brought his knee up into the man's face so hard that the sound of it turned Maeve's stomach. Renaud went down and didn't get up. The shorter one scrabbled for his own waistband and found Thomas's pistol already pressed cold against the soft place behind his ear. "Drag your friend out," Volkov said, wiping a fleck of blood off his cuff with a handkerchief, "and tell Emile Lachance that if he sends his garbage into my territory again, I'll send it back to him a piece at a time, in the post. Go." The man went, hauling his groaning partner by the collar out into the storm. Then the room was quiet again, just the wind and the broken door swinging, and Maxim Volkov turned and looked at Maeve Donnelly, where she stood against the bar, chest heaving, a ribbon of red running down into her shoe. He came toward her slowly. The danger came off him in waves, but his eyes had gone strange and dark, and when he stopped, he was close enough that his coat brushed against her. He lifted one gloved hand and touched the side of her face, and the gentleness of it after the violence of a moment before sent a confusing, unwelcome jolt straight down her spine. "You're bleeding," he said. "I'm fine." She knocked his hand away and hated that her own voice shook when she did it. "I didn't need rescuing. I had a lantern." The tenderness blinked out of his face like a candle pinched between two fingers, and the old arrogance flooded back in. He leaned in until his mouth was an inch from her ear. "You were 30 seconds from a knife in the belly, bookkeeper. I just saved your life. Most people would be thanking me on the floor." He drew back and looked down at her with that familiar, mocking certainty, the certainty of a man who had bought the entire world and assumed he'd bought her too. "Go on," he said softly. "On your knees. Thank me properly." Maeve looked at him. She tasted copper where she'd bitten her lip in the fall. She looked at this beautiful, terrible man who thought a person's dignity was a thing you could win at the point of a gun. And very deliberately she reached down, picked the broken stem of a wine glass off the bar, and set it upright between them like a small, glittering wall. "I don't kneel, Mr. Volkov," she said, and her voice was rock steady. "Not for the men who threaten me, and not for the ones who save me. You'll have to find your kneeling somewhere else." The silence stretched out long enough to hum. He didn't strike her. He didn't raise his voice. A muscle ticked once in his jaw, and something kindled in the grey of his eyes that frightened her far more than his anger ever had. A deep, patient, almost hungry attention, like a man who has finally found the one locked door in a house he owns. "We'll see," he said quietly, and he turned and walked out into the snow. The Monday after, Gilles Tremblay did not come to work. In his place stood a smooth young lawyer in an excellent coat, who informed the staff of the Maison Corbeau, very politely, that the establishment had been acquired in full by a numbered company, and that the numbered company belonged to Mr. Volkov. Maeve's stomach dropped through the floor. He hadn't just escalated. He'd bought the entire battlefield out from under her. And yet, the torment stopped. He didn't trip her in the aisle anymore. There were no more brochures under the salt. He simply came in, took his booth, and watched her. His grey eyes followed every confident pivot she made across the floor, on her thick, sure legs, the easy strength in her shoulders. When she swung a loaded tray the busboys struggled with, the silence of it unnerved her far worse than any insult. It was the quiet of a man studying something he had decided to understand. But Maeve had a problem larger than Volkov's staring, and she was the only person in the building who knew it, because she'd gone back into the Corbeau's books with the word "lachance" ringing in her ears. And she'd found it, a second column, hidden in plain sight, skimmed in small ugly amounts off the cash nights for the better part of a year, routed through a supplier that didn't exist. Somebody close to Volkov had been bleeding him quietly and feeding the difference to Emile Lachance, buying the Lachance crew a foothold in the West End one stolen night's take at a time. The broken jaw Volkov had handed Renaud in the doorway hadn't started a war. It had simply made a war that was already half-built visible, and the name attached to the phantom supplier when she finally traced it through 3 shell accounts at 2 a.m. at the office desk, with her coat still on against the cold. The name made her go very still, because it belonged to Thomas, the big quiet one, the man Volkov trusted with his life and his back booth. She was still sitting with that knowledge, sick with it, when they came for her. It was a Tuesday night, brutal cold, the wind screaming down Saint-Denis. Maeve had just got the door of her cramped third-floor walk-up open, when a hand the size of a dinner plate clamped over her mouth from behind, tasting of cigarettes and snow. "Not a sound, fat girl." A second man kicked the door shut, and the apartment went dark. It was the shorter Lachance man from the restaurant, and a stranger built like a refrigerator. Panic seized Maeve's chest, and she shoved it down with everything she had, because years of being the biggest body in every room had taught her one true thing. She was not small, and she would be damned before she'd act like it. "Lachance wants those books you've been reading," the short one hissed, dragging a revolver from his coat. "And then Volkov gets to watch us put you in the river before he goes in after you." He shoved her hard toward the middle of the room, expecting her to stumble and go down. He had badly misjudged where her weight sat. Maeve planted her thick, solid legs and took the shove without a step, and instead of falling, she used the turn of it, swinging her heavy shoulder bag, keys, a steel thermos, a roll of loonies for the laundromat, around in a flat, brutal arc that caught him across the temple with a sound like a dropped melon. He went sideways, howling, the gun spinning out of his hand into the dark. The big one rushed her, wrapping both arms around her wide waist to take her off her feet. Maeve roared, a sound that came up from somewhere she didn't know she had, and threw all of herself backward, slamming him into the wall hard enough that the plaster cracked, and the breath left him in a single whistling gust. She drove her elbow into his ribs once, twice. But the short one was up, blood sheeting down the side of his face, and he caught up the cast-iron kettle off her little stove and swung it. It took her across the shoulder, and the pain detonated all the way down her arm and put her on her knees, and her vision swam, and she looked up to find the muzzle of the revolver pointing at the center of her forehead. "Clever bitch," the short one panted. "Should have stayed invisible." The shot was deafening. The pain never came. The short one's eyes rolled white, and he folded onto her thin carpet in a heap, and standing in her broken doorway, snow at his back, was Maxim Volkov. His coat was torn open, and the left side of his white shirt was going dark and wet with his own blood. He had a pistol in his hand, the barrel smoking, and no Tomas, no young one, nobody behind him at all. He had come up 3 flights alone and bleeding. The big refrigerator of a man, seeing his boss arrive wounded, abandoned Maeve entirely and charged Volkov with a blade. And Volkov, slowed by the bullet already in his side, got off one shot that went wide before the man crashed into him, and they went down together in the narrow hall. The gun skittered out of reach. The blade came up. "Hey," Maeve bellowed. She didn't look for a weapon, she became one. She came up off the floor and across the room and hit the man with the full freight of her body, shoulder into his spine, and the sheer momentum of all of her lifted him clean off Volkov and slammed him into the radiator under the window. The same rusted radiator her landlord had ignored for 2 winters. The old valve sheared off, and a jet of scalding water erupted into the man's face. He screamed, clawing blindly at his eyes, and pitched himself out the door and down the stairs into the storm, and was gone. Then it was quiet, just the hiss of the broken radiator, and 2 people breathing hard in the steam and the dark. Maeve pushed herself up. Her shoulder was screaming, her uniform was torn, her calf had reopened. She looked down at the most feared man in Montreal, slumped against her cheap wall with his hand pressed to his ribs, his face the color of paper, the arrogance gone out of it entirely. "You," Volkov rasped, staring at her like he'd never seen her before. "You just saved your miserable life," Maeve finished, already grabbing a dish towel off the rail and dropping a disdouane at him to press it hard against the wound. "Now hush, let's see one of your skinny doorway models haul you down 3 flights before the police get here. Lean on me." And for the first time in his life, Maxim Volkov leaned the whole of his weight on another human being and let her take it. His people came 20 minutes later, a doctor among them, and they got him to a sterile glass, pent house high above the Gold Coast lights of the city, and dug the bullet out of his ribs, while Maeve sat on a sofa, worth more than her building, soaked in his blood and her own, too wrung out to shake. She'd had cash enough in the coffee tin at home to be on a bus back to her mother's by morning. Something she could not name kept her in the chair instead. 2 hours on, the bedroom door opened, and he came out bare to the waist and wrapped in white bandaging, moving slow, no suit and no menace, just a big wounded man crossing a room toward her. "The doctor says I'd have bled out on that ugly little floor of yours," he said, and his gravel voice had gone soft in a way she'd never heard. "If you hadn't kept the pressure on and carried me down, I'll send you my dry cleaning bill," Maeve said. "And one for the radiator." He didn't laugh. He stood over her, and his eyes moved across her. The heavy arms that had thrown a grown man into a wall, the soft, wide span of her, the broad shoulders, the steady, exhausted face, and there was nothing left in his expression of the man who'd called her a dessert cart. There was something that looked terribly like worship. "Why," he said, very low, "why fight for me? I've been nothing to you but a cruelty in a good suit." "Because I don't let bullies win," Maeve said, and her voice shook with the adrenaline still leaving her body. "Not LaChance's men. Not you. You looked at me, and you saw a thing taking up too much room in your perfect tailored world. But I'll tell you what I saw the first night, the second I added up your bill. I saw a man being robbed by someone close enough to pour his wine." She held his eyes. "It's Tomas. He's been skimming you for LaChance for a year. The books don't lie, even when everyone around them does." Something went through him then. Not surprise, exactly, but a slow, terrible confirmation, as if she'd put words to a draft he'd been feeling for months and refusing to name. "I know," he said at last, quiet. "I think I've known. I didn't want to." He lowered himself onto the table edge in front of her, wincing. "I didn't single you out because you don't belong in my world, Maeve. I singled you out because you're the only honest thing I've stood next to in 10 years. Everyone lies to me. They bow, they scrape, they tell me whatever keeps them breathing. And you poured my own math back over me in front of my men and dared me to count it." He shook his head slowly. "Your nerve. It made me want to break it, just to prove it would break like everything else. It didn't break. You only got harder to look away from." He reached out and brushed a loose strand of hair off her cheek with a calloused thumb. "You're not in anyone's way. You're the only person in this city, standing exactly where she means to." Maeve stood up. She was inches from him, and she did not melt, and she did not soften, and she kept her spine straight as a beam. "Words come cheap, Mr. Volkov," she said. "You told me to know my place. You told me to kneel and thank you properly. You decided a person's worth was something you could read off a dress size." Her chin came up. "If you're sorry, sorry's easy. Prove it." The penthouse went so quiet, she could hear the wind against the glass 40 floors up. Maxim Volkov was a king. He answered to no one. He had built an empire of fear and run it for 15 years from behind a back booth. He looked into Maeve Donnelly's fierce, tired, beautiful face, and then, slowly, with the bullet wound pulling and his breath catching on the pain of it, he lowered himself down. His knees met the cold, pale floor. He looked up at the heavy, magnificent woman who had wrecked his pride, and then carried his bleeding body down 3 flights of stairs in a storm. And he took her thick, scarred, beautiful hands in both of his, and pressed his mouth to her knuckles like a man at prayer. "I'm on my knees," he said, his grey eyes turned up to her, every wall down. "I'm sorry, Maeve. I'm yours. Tell me what you want." A slow, victorious warmth spread across Maeve's face. She drew one hand free and cupped his jaw, tilting his head up to look at her properly. "What I want," she said softly, "is for you to get up off that floor before you tear your stitches. We've a thief in your house, and an Irishman's worth of trouble named LaChance coming for us both. And I'm the only one in this city who can read the books that'll bury them." She helped him to his feet, taking his weight again against her own sure hips, and there at the top of the world, with the snow falling silver past the glass, the most feared man in Montreal smiled at her, like a man who had finally come in out of the cold. "So get up, Your Highness. We've got an empire to clean,